Thank you very much for joining us here today for the interview with the Global Agenda, Donald. It's actually companies that drive the livestock sector, and it's governments who are obliged to seek equity. Now, you represent the private sector interests on the Global Agenda, those of the dairy sector. What would you say were the challenges in terms of trying to reconcile those two different perspectives on the Global Agenda?
The organisations in the dairy sector which I work in, a lot of the commercial entities are actually cooperatives that are owned by farmers. And one of the reasons farmers band together into co-ops is to provide a way for them to jointly to access a formal market. And so if you think about the dairy sector, a lot of farmers are smaller in size. They don't have the ability to process their product individually, so they're looking for a cooperative banding together that can afford to develop the assets needed to process dairy products. If you look at the global dairy industry, there are 133 million dairy farms in the world. There's 600 million people living on those dairy farms. And then if you take the people who work upstream and downstream from the dairy farm into account, you end up with another 400 million people whose livelihoods depend upon dairy. So we've got an industry that supports 1 billion people's livelihoods. Never mind the 6 billion people in the world who regularly consume dairy product. So when you're talking about, companies are interested in profit, yeah, they are. But at the core, the dairy sector is supporting a huge number of people's livelihoods, and it does it in a way that is sustainable and equitable. And so I think dairying at the core is a fantastic way to help alleviate poverty in parts of the world. It's a fantastic way to improve the nutritional status of families and of communities. And if you look at dairying even in developed countries as opposed to developing countries, where you have a vibrant dairy community, you have rural towns that are still booming, that have got schools and shops and so on. You go to the parts of the country that don't have that same, that may have gone to monoculture, monocropping. You have streets that are empty.
Agriculture ministers tend to come from very different backgrounds in developing countries, and they also need to juggle very different interests, agendas, and so forth behind it. What are you telling them to convince them of your agenda?
I think one of the challenges that we face, or one of the topics we're trying to address within the livestock sector at the moment, is how do we demonstrate to people the value that's created by investments in livestock? And so if you're an agriculture minister, you have many different opportunities or options in terms of how you address agricultural development in your country or in your region. And one of the things that we're interested in doing is being able to explain to those agricultural ministers the value of livestock, or more particularly in our case, dairying, and the additional benefit that comes from investing in dairy development as opposed to investing in other forms of development. High quality proteins are one of the best ways that you can address those challenges around population-based challenges around nutrition, and that's where dairying comes in. Now, that's not to say we think dairying is the only answer. In fact, in most parts of the world, dairying is part of a mixed farming system. But again, if you can add dairying into, predominantly a cropping system, if you can add dairying in, even if it's only 1 or 2 cows, you lift the nutritional status and you start to provide regular cash flow. And I think that's one of the key benefits about dairying. If you think about it in those terms, when you're milking dairy cows, consuming what you need for your own family and then selling the rest either at the local level or if you've got access to formal market, you're getting regular cash flow into your family, which is quite a big benefit for a lot of families.
The Global Agenda is about sustainable livestock, which in a way means that it tries to go on a different path when it comes to industrialization. Is there any new research? Are there any new ways that would guide the way on this new path?
You're right. In more industrialized, more developed countries, you tend to have larger herd sizes. There tends to be a consolidation. In the developing world, that's not really the model that people start with, although sometimes they'll move towards that, in certain parts of the world. I think there are lessons to be learned from both types of models. So the industrialized model, if you want to call it that, or I would call it a more intensive model, does have some benefits for scale and for yield and various other things. It's difficult for a lot of people to see the way in which they would move towards that sort of more intensive model. I think there are good practices that can be applied to both models. You started addressing the topic in the question of sustainability. Well, sustainability sits on three dimensions, as we all know: economic sustainability, and often in that, in the developed world, in order to achieve that, you're looking for scale. There are ways that you can address economic stability in a smaller scale farm through yield improvement and various other things. You've then got the social dimension, and that was really what I was talking about a little bit before, about the role that dairy plays in lifting people out of poverty, the role that dairy plays in creating vibrant rural communities and so on, the role that dairy plays nutritionally sits in that social dimension. So you've got economic, social, and then the environmental. And environmental is obviously an area where livestock faces some more challenges, particularly from perceptions people have about the role that livestock plays in gas emission and various other things. And so as a responsible sector, I think we have a lot of challenges we have to address in that environmental area. But I'd also say I think we need to accept that any form of agriculture is going to have an environmental footprint. And the challenge that we have to address in all forms of agriculture, not just in livestock or in dairying, is how do we minimize the impacts we have on the environment. And that doesn't mean going to scale. It means that you need to find ways within your own system, within your own context, for how you can minimize those environmental impacts and make the greatest yield gain within that environment.
How can the global agenda help you with those goals that your organization sets itself?
Part of the reason that we wanted to join this was we could see the work that was going on, particularly in the environmental area around the LEAP initiative. We've adopted the methods that came out of LEAP for measuring greenhouse gas emission, etc. Working with the leadership within GASL, we could see ways in which working with a global program such as the agenda was going to help us achieve our own outcomes as well. One of the things we're really keen to explore is the way in which dairy can help alleviate poverty. So we think dairy offers a fantastic opportunity to lift people, nutritionally and economically, and indeed gender-wise. If you look at the role dairy plays, and a lot of farms around the world are actually women-led, dairying farms, female-led. So we think there's a great opportunity for us to better position dairy, as we go back to before with those discussions with ministers and so on. In order to do that, we need to work with a credible partner organisation. So we see the opportunity to work with GASL to develop papers around things like poverty alleviation. The other area that we're very keen to explore is to come up with a methodology for how can you value investment in dairy development or in livestock development more generally, but for us dairy development, so that we can go to those sort of foundation donor organizations and say to them, if you want to invest in improving nutritional status, improving the environment, improving social outcomes, improving equity rights, if you want to do that, if you invest in dairy development, here are the returns you get. And so those are the sort of opportunities we see working with a multi-stakeholder partnership group like GASL.
What do you think is the single most important thing that needs to be done in your sector right now?
It's going to be a lack of understanding about what I think of as the holistic food system. So there are a lot of people out there who are making very simplistic determinations. They're saying, that livestock emits a lot of greenhouse gases, therefore livestock's bad for the environment, so we should consume more plant-based foods and less livestock-based foods. It's a very simplistic interpretation of what is a very complex problem. If you look at all of the dimensions you need to consider in a sustainable food system, everything from the environmental, the social, the economic aspects, you look at the way livestock tends to provide better paying jobs, more employment per output. If you look at the quality of the protein that's contained within livestock, etc., you've got a much better position. And what we'd like to see is where people are looking at this holistically. Sadly, to be honest, a lot of the science and a lot of the data doesn't exist yet. And we need to work with groups like GASL and others, with FAO and with the UN, to produce that full data set so proper determinations can be made rather than people jumping to simple outcomes.
If I get you right now, this would mean that you would engage into a very large information campaign to change people's behavior. But maybe information alone will not do it.
Wow, that is a fantastic question. How do you change people's attitudes, right? Effectively is what we're talking about. I think the lovely thing is that, you know, when you've got a product like dairy or indeed most livestock products, people actually enjoy consuming it. So that's the first thing. You've got a product that people enjoy consuming. So how difficult is it to change people's minds? Well, if they enjoy consuming your product, that's like the first big step. The second thing is that we really have got to address these issues around people's perceptions of the environmental footprint, people's perceptions of animal care issues and so on. So we can demonstrate to them that, you know, farmers in the dairy sector, they get up every day, they care responsibly for their livestock. They work to make the land better for future generations. We need to show people the way in which dairy sector is really, in fact, farmers, not just dairy sector, farmers generally. They really care for what they're doing. And as most of the farmers I talk to say to me, they say sustainable business is good business. You know, so this isn't something that they do that's a chore, it makes their business better. What we need to do is reconnect consumers with what farmers are doing. If you go back to when I was a kid growing up, which is, you know, 300 or 400 years ago, I suppose, not quite, but most of us knew people who were farmers. You go today, and I can't remember the stats in the US, it's something like, you know, in the US less than 1% or 2% of the population are involved in agriculture now. Yet, you go back 40, 50 years, it was like 8, 10%. So we all knew somebody who was involved in farming. Today, a lot of people are so disconnected with where their food's coming from that they don't understand the process that goes into producing food. We need to reconnect consumers with that. How do we do it? It's a fantastic challenge. And, you know, we need to start using all the tools at our disposal. And to be honest, we've probably made assumptions for too long that consumers understand the value of dairy and, you know, the nutritional value and various other things. But we've also got to appeal to all of the dimensions, not just nutrition. We've got to explain how we care for the land, how we make the world a better place, how we work with families, family-based farms in all parts of the world to lift people up to give them a better life.
Thank you very much.